All right, guys. Uh, Welcome aboard for the May 15th edition of the Mac Forum Weekly Video Chat. Hopefully, you are having a good evening and are looking forward to some of the tips and tricks and other Mac and Apple related information that we'll be passing out tonight. We are audio only this evening, so if you get the weird blue circle in the middle of your video, there's nothing wrong. We're just audio only tonight. Let's get right into everything. First of all, welcome to our newest member, Emma Scarlett. Our membership is growing steadily, and we got a lot of helpful people. So if you're experiencing a problem and you need to ask a question, go ahead and become a member if you haven't done so already. The areas for contact us and the like are not good places to post your questions because they're only seen by the relatively small number of people in the moderation team. Let's get right into today's information. First of all, right on our own Mac Forum site, uh, member PGB1 has started a thread about icons jumping around on the desktop. And it took me a minute to understand exactly what was meant. And then finally, one of our other members realized what was going on. If you do not have your uh, desktop settings set to snap to grid, then the icons are going to jump all over the place as you move things around, as you interact with different items, and they're going to line up in places that, they may be one place one time and another place later on. So the way to fix that is to pick a blank area of the desktop and right click on that area, and you'll be able to get into settings and change the settings for the icon placement to snap to grid. And that should force everything to line up neatly for you. And you can, while you're doing that, you can also rearrange things a little bit so that you get the icons arranged by kind, if you like. What you're going to do is you're going to go into the sort by settings. You're going to right click, choose your about the third or fourth option down is going to be sort by. And from there, you're going to choose snap to grid. And then you also have the option of choosing whether you want the icons arranged by name, kind. There are a number of other options there. So that should take care of the icon jumping part of that thread. Um, in the remainder of the thread, the relative merit of having different icons on the desktop was discussed. Some people have quite a few. I'm looking at my desktop right now, and I've got more stuff on the desktop than I normally do. I've got roughly, let's see, that's 4 rows, 5 rows of icons, and each row has 3, 6, 9, 12. So about a dozen icons on the each row. So I've got roughly 60 things if you count my external drives that are mounted. And some of you who have followed the Mac all the way back to System 7 days and maybe a little bit sooner than that, System 8, you know that one of the things that people frequently complained about was that it was bad practice to have a large number of icons on the desktop because each one of those icons has to be redrawn whenever you interact with the desktop and make any kind of change. And on the older machines, the system would slow down sometimes quite significantly when you had too many of these on there. And because the desktop, as far as the file system is concerned, was essentially a big folder, there was a limit to the number of things that you could have on the desktop. At one point, it was around 50 to 51 items, assuming that there was no subfolder structure involved. So to this day, a lot of users still encourage you to keep the number of icons low. It's not as big a speed problem on newer machines, but it still means that your OS boot time is going to be affected a little bit by the number of icons, especially if you keep um, a large number of icons on your desktop. I know a couple of Windows users that have their Windows desktop littered with icons. There may, on one of them, I can think of, there may be 100 things. There are icons on top of icons, which I find a little bit confusing, but apparently it works for them. So have a look at that thread. There are some suggestions in there for clearing out that clutter. And if you've got another suggestion that works even better, I'm sure our members would like to hear it. Another thread this week started by member Rod Sprague. Now, I know that Rod has not listened to the last couple of shows. How do I know this? Because Rod is experiencing a problem that we talked about 2 weeks ago. Let me give you an idea of what's happening. When Rod downloads an iOS app on his phone or iPad, and then when he goes to sync with iTunes, he discovered that the apps were not being moved over into his iTunes library. And he likes to keep a copy of the apps in the iTunes library so that if he chooses to delete an app or something and then put it back later on, he doesn't have to re download it. Well, prior to uh, the recent incarnation of iOS, starting, I believe, with 9.2, Apple changed the behavior a little bit. In previous versions of iOS, what you had happen was if you downloaded an app on your iPad or your iPhone, when you sync your device with iTunes, any files that were on any apps that were on your iPhone, on your iDevice, but not in the library, would get moved onto your iTunes library. Well, that's not happening now, and here's part of the reason why. This seems to be a deliberate change, and here's part of the reason why. In the past, up until about iOS 9.1, when you downloaded an app onto your iDevice, it downloaded what you might refer to as a universal app. So, in other words, let's say you had the iPhone version on your phone, it probably contained the code for the iPad version as well. So that if you had an iPad, it would you'd be able to move that app rather easily into your library and then from there onto the iPad. Well, right now Apple has changed that behavior, and a lot of developers are taking advantage of this. What's happening now is that the downloads, when you download an app on the iDevice, it contains only the code for the device you've downloaded it on. So, for example, if you download it on your iPhone, that version does not have the code for the iPad or other iOS variants. So, what you need to do is to go into iTunes, log into the iTunes store, go to the iOS apps, and download them manually, or set it so that it automatically downloads those apps. If you'd like a little more information about that, you can read. I posted a note to an article by Kirk, the iTunes guy, McLaren, in Macworld, and I've also got, I believe, a link to the thread that Rod started. Gives you a little more information from the developer side of things. This is the second article that I linked to in the thread is a tech note for developers. Goes into a little bit of background about how this was accomplished. Also, in the same article by Kirk, the iTunes guy, he mentioned something that I haven't discussed before. I don't normally run into this issue because I don't keep a lot of video on my phone or the iPad. Putting video on those devices can eat a lot of data, or a lot of space rather. And if you've got a 16 gigabyte device, you're not going to get very many videos plus all the other stuff on there if you start loading a lot of video. But as he points out, uh, some users with large movie collections have noticed that they have difficulty locating the content that they want to put on their iOS device. So if they got a large number of video clips and movies and etc., the only way you can do it in the iTunes Sync movie panel is it shows you all of them alphabetically. Now that's okay if you've only got a few to go through, but as the numbers increase, it can get a little bit difficult to find the version that you're looking for. So Kirk's suggestion, which he goes into in a little more detail in the article, is to create a playlist that contains the information that you want to sync. So create a playlist, name it something like iPad video, iPhone video, whatever makes sense to you, and then move video that you want to sync with your device into that playlist and tell iTunes that you want to sync that playlist. By doing that, by looking at the video in the playlist, you can organize it by date added. You can organize it by uh, the, for example, by title. You can do all kinds of things that you couldn't do from the iTunes sync pane. And that little tip is at the same article where Kurt describes this idea about slimming down iOS apps so that they don't contain all of the code. So I just had one link to both of those articles. They're part of the same Q&A session, for example. Uh, Also, once again, I want to reiterate something this week that I've said before in the way of tip. Uh, I've mentioned to you that there are some advantages sometimes of exploring the built in Apple applications before you shell out a lot of dough for third party apps. Uh, I used to use PowerPoint quite a bit. I was never what you would call a PowerPoint maven, but I was much more fluent with the previous version than I am with what I have on the machine now, the 2011 edition for the Mac. To be honest with you, I'm not thrilled with the interface to that program or to the whole Office suite, even though it mimics uh, uh, the PC version. Because the current PC versions, I'm constantly looking for things that I used to know where they are, particularly in PowerPoint, which I don't use very often. And earlier this week, I was helping a colleague at work, and I volunteered to do a quick little PowerPoint presentation for them. And when I got ready to load up PowerPoint and start adding graphics and the like, uh, yeah, I just got really frustrated really fast because of the differences in the interface. So what I did is to launch Keynote, which is a to me is a much simpler and cleaner setup for doing really basic things. And then built the PowerPoint, built the slideshow in Keynote, and then exported it out. You have several export options when you build it in Keynote. One of them is built into two different PowerPoint versions, and I transferred one of those over to the PC exported it out as a PowerPoint, transferred it over to the PC. Almost everything transferred okay. I did notice that with one version, the PC had a little trouble opening it, but we were able to get a version that worked. As a backup, and I'm glad I did, I exported one version of the slideshow out as a QuickTime movie because the version of PowerPoint that they had gets a little squirrely every now and then. And I'm kind of glad I did that because when we got ready to play it on Friday, on Thursday, I tested the PowerPoint and it worked. And I came in Thursday evening, made a couple of minor changes at home, and exported the slideshow back out, put it on a CD, go to play it on Friday when we needed it, and the PowerPoint versions were not loading correctly. I still haven't chased that down, but fortunately, the QuickTime version that we had saved worked quite nicely. So the my first tip there is to be aware of what the software that's already on your machine can do, and also keep in mind when you save things as you transfer from one format to another. Um, you may lose different things. You may have to redesign things sometimes. And that would be true even if you were using the same program. For example, even on the PC side, if you save in the newest version of PowerPoint, and then you try to open that same version in an older edition of PowerPoint, it might or might not work depending upon whatever differences Microsoft has introduced and how old the version is that you're dealing with. So it kind of helps to do a test run long before you need it so you can work out any of the kinks that might arise there. Also, as by way of a quick little Mac tip. I've mentioned this one before, but it came up in another thread on the forum. So I want to go back and just real quickly mention this one to you. If you are having problems with, uh, let's say you've got some stuff stored on a time capsule, like your time machine backups, for example, and you find that the time machine backup is really slow. Under normal circumstances, if I had my time machine backup on an external hard drive, I would launch disk utility and look at that hard drive and see if there are any errors that drive errors that need to be corrected. You cannot do that with disk utility on a time capsule. Disk utility will not, quote, see, unquote, the time capsule. What you have to do in that situation, whether it's got time machine backups on it or not, if you want to examine that time capsule drive, you've got to go into the Apple utility that manages airport and go there and look inside it, and there you'll be able to verify the drive. I'm gonna real quickly pull that screen up because I've forgotten the exact sequence, but what you're going to do, that utility is inside your utility folder in applications. So it's applications, utilities, and then you're looking for the airport utility. Once you launch that and it sees your device, then one of your options when you click on the device is you can go in and bring up a lot of information, edit the information, look at that. You'll be able to check the disk and do a little bit of verification there. Uh, it's not a great thing, but it's probably about the best option that you have, really. Uh, Apple, I've got a link to the Apple Tech article that explains how to do this so that you can see the information that they have. But the part that I want to be sure that I kind of reprise, if you will, because this is something that is not very well known. Let's suppose, for example, that you verified the drive using the airport utility. The drive itself is okay, but you're still seeing weird behavior and you're starting to wonder what's going on. Here's one more thing that you can check. When you store time machine backups on a time capsule or other network device, they get stored in a file called a sparse bundle. Now, a sparse bundle is very similar to the kind of disk image that you get when you download a piece of software, but it has the ability to expand and contract. So as more and more backups are added to this sparse bundle file, the size of the actual bundle file grows. Now, occasionally, that file will become a little bit corrupted, or there'll be some other issues. Here's one way that you might be able to fix the problem. Um, what you want to do is find that sparse bundle file. It usually has the name of your computer. So if your computer is named HAL, for example, the sparse bundle for those time machine backups will probably have that same name unless you've changed it for some reason. What you want to do is double click on that sparse bundle and it will mount, assuming it's not been horribly corrupted beyond repair, it should mount in the Finder and appear as a regular drive. If it doesn't, go into the Finder settings and make sure that you've got drives set to show on your desktop. Once you've got that virtual drive on your desktop, now Disk Utility can see HAL, or whatever the file is called, as a hard drive. And you can run drive verification, see if there are some issues, and if necessary, repair disk errors. Now, I'm not talking about in this case permission repairs. I'm talking specifically about directory structure type errors. I haven't done this in quite some time, but I believe it will also see certain kinds of permissions errors. I haven't had to do that under El Capitan yet, so I'm not sure if that function is still there, but certainly the other is. So that's a good one to keep in mind. All right, now that we've dispensed basically with the tips and tricks here, let's go ahead and move into some Apple related news and computer related news for the week. A couple things stuck out in my mind. Uh, First of all, if you're a big torrent user, you might have noticed this week that Swedish courts have basically handed over Pirate Bay sites to the Swedish government. There has been a back and forth in the courts, in their courts, about Pirate Bay. For those of you not familiar with it, Pirate Bay is a website that is known for torrents of copyrighted material. And as you know, also, that is in most countries, downloading those torrents is a violation of copyright law. And so the prosecutors in Sweden took a different approach. This time, instead of going after individuals specifically, they went after the domains themselves. Under the, as I understand the ruling, the two domains that were most popularly used for Pirate Bay, their contention is that these domains were being used to facilitate criminal activity, i.e., copyright infringement, and therefore they should be seized. Well, initially they won in that standing. The Pirate Bay sites uh, took the case to court again and got the right to keep the domains. But now an appellate court has looked at this and basically agreed that these sites need to be handed over to the Swedish government because they're essentially facilitating copyright violations. That's a non-technical, non-lawyer review of what I was able to find. I've got a link to the article as well as a Hacker News article on that same front about explaining a little bit more about what was specifically involved, what was claimed in the lawsuit. There are probably some more appeals on the way, so keep an eye out on that one. I personally have avoided torrent sites in part because of how often the torrents for some of these sites are loaded with malware. Okay. When I figure out the amount of time that people lose by getting, uh, for lack of a better word, contaminated software from these sites, particularly if you're a Windows user, where some of the stuff that's appeared has gone well beyond malware into actual viruses. Uh, it's not something that I want to get involved in. So you can have a look at that if you have any inclination to follow that. It's going to be, I think it's going to be an interesting set of uh, legal decisions to follow because if this holds up there, I can see copyright holders encouraging other governments to do likewise, to go after not necessarily individual users, but to go after the domains of those sites and basically lock those domains down. Uh, on a different note, last week I mentioned that a few users, I mentioned something from the Kirkville site, Kirk McLaren, uh, and he had ran an article talking about how some users are reporting that if they use Apple Music, some of the Apple Music services, files were being deleted from their hard drives. Now, I still don't know exactly what's causing this. Some people have suggested that it's a user error that is partly facilitated by a couple of poorly written iTunes dialogues. Apple has finally acknowledged that this is an issue, although apparently they haven't had a lot of luck tracking down the issue, in part because it seems to only right now affect a small number of people. Uh, there is an update story in Macworld, though, that suggests that an update to iTunes may be coming as early as next week to address this issue. I'm not quite sure how they're going to do that if they haven't fixed, if they haven't figured out exactly where the problem is, unless they're going to rewrite a couple of the dialogues that some users have suggested are part of the problem. All right, Cult of Mac has a couple of suggestions, if you will, for things they would like to see in iOS 10. Everyone is expecting iOS 10 to be announced at um, WWDC next month. And generally speaking, the consensus seems to be that they don't expect a huge hardware change or hardware improvement at WWDC, but that what you will see are changes going forward to iOS 10. Some of them, I'm still reading through that. Some of them have the potential to be pretty interesting, though. I have a link to that little quick summary. Personally, I can't wait for WWDC. I keep hoping they'll announce that I get free gear, but that's not going to happen. So we'll just move on. And I said for years when they were doing the iOS names, that when they were doing the OS 10 names after big cats, if they wanted to name one of them Sylvester, I would gladly be the spokesman for them. But apparently that did not fly well at Cupertino, perhaps because they were afraid of a little bit of difficulty with the Warner Brothers people and Sylvester the Cat. So hey, I lose out there as well. Okay, but on a different note, um, I saw something that I'm still working my way through, but it's really interesting to me. Um, the original developers of Siri are apparently demoing a new virtual assistant that's much more versatile. They've apparently nicknamed it Viv. And what's going to make it really interesting is that it's capable, or seems to be capable, from the demo that I was reading about. It seems to be capable of doing complex searches in ways that are somewhat difficult for Siri to do natively. So it's going to be interesting to see. I haven't used Siri a lot just because I haven't taken the time to really get familiar with it. I've used it a few times to add appointments to my calendar and a couple other things, but I know it's capable of far more than I've done with it. There are some times when I probably would use it more, but don't have a good enough connection to make that work. So this is going to be interesting to see. Uh, they did a 20-minute demo at Disrupt NYC, and Viv apparently was able to handle several complex requests, not just in terms of understanding them, but actually being able to execute the searches correctly and perform the functions that it was asked to do. So this is going to be an interesting thing to follow over the next couple of months. Hopefully, we'll see some variation of Viv. It's been compared loosely to Cortana in Windows, similar in terms of concept, the complexity of the searches that are involved. So that's going to be interesting to keep an eye out. And finally, from our friends at Cult of Mac again, they are saying that Apple has now cut the time that it takes to get approval for iOS apps. Initially, if you followed our forum for a while, you know that our forum member Van Smith has done some development under Android and a little bit under iOS, and he's submitted both to the Google Play Store and to Android rather, and to iOS, and has posted before about some of the differences in the posting process. One of the complaints has always been that it took quite a period of time to get a new version of an app approved or to get a new app approved, particularly if you're starting from scratch. Initially, there were some reports that it would take a couple of weeks to get that done. A lot of developers did not like that. Now, there is a report from Cult of Mac that Apple has cut this approval time significantly. It was down to about 8 days, but there has been some reports showing up on the web that they've cut that approval time. I'm looking at a story uh, dated May the 12th from Cult of Mac that essentially says they're seeing some reports of the approval process basically taking 1 day. And if they can get that done, uh, that's going to be a big deal to a lot of developers. That was one of their complaints initially. Um, the other thing that people have suggested that likely to be handled soon is improvement to the search functions in the iTunes store, particularly in the apps section. I think I'll be curious to see how that goes in the weeks and months to come. But certainly, if you're an app developer, the idea that they can get your app approved far more quickly is bound to be a good thing, particularly if you're in a competitive segment of the market and you want to get your app out the door before your competitors do. So that's going to be something to keep an eye out for. And that's going to just about do it, folks. Didn't have quite as many tips and tricks this week as I had hoped to. Some of the stuff that I went through in the stack of junk were some things that some of the stuff that I had put in the possible list of things to talk about were things that we had addressed a couple of weeks ago, or in some cases, a couple of months ago. So didn't want to repeat those, except for the tip about uh, iOS apps not syncing back to your iTunes library. Don't expect that to happen anymore. You've got to go in and re-download those, and it's not that that's a cumbersome process. It's actually pretty easy to do because when you log into the store, one of your options is for you to show apps that are not in your library, apps that you've downloaded that are not in your library. But it is something you need to be aware of and know to do. All right, guys. Well, that's going to just about do it for this week. I hope that you've enjoyed the show. Hopefully, I'll have a few more tips and tricks for you next week, along with the usual roundup of forum info and Mac or Apple related news. Until next week, this is your host, Sly Dude, welcoming you for thanking you for tuning into the show. And I hope if you've got a comment or a tip that you'd like to pass on that I don't know about, put it in the show thread. It's in the news and community announcements section of the forum. You can post it there, or you can send me a PM. Until next week, we'll see you in the forum.